The train whistle was a mournful cry against the vast, indifferent silence of the plains. When it faded, it took the last remnant of a world Finn had known, leaving him standing on a splintered platform at the absolute end of the line. He was 18 years old, and his entire worldly inheritance was contained in a single, folded document in his coat pocket and the meager satchel at his feet. The air was thin and sharp, carrying the iron scent of coming snow. Before him lay the town of Prosperity Gulch, a name so ambitious it felt like a bitter joke. It was a handful of tired wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth, their unpainted faces grim under a sky the color of slate. A man in a thick coat, the town's designated welcomer of the unfortunate, pointed a gloved finger towards a siding where the main track dissolved into weeds and rust. "There she is," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, just like the letter says. "Your father's last property." Finn's eyes followed, and he saw it. It was a ghost, a memory of motion stranded in a field of frozen mud. An old passenger railcar, resting on a disconnected length of track, sat listing slightly to one side. Its color, even under a thick layer of grime and a dusting of early snow, was unmistakable, a deep and brilliant turquoise. It was a slash of impossible vibrancy in a world of brown and gray, a piece of a fallen sky. It looked less like an inheritance and more like a punishment, a final, cruel jest from a father he barely remembered. The official grunted, a sound of finality, and turned back toward the meager warmth of the town without another word, his duty done. Finn was alone with his legacy. He walked towards it, the crunch of his worn boots on the frostbitten ground the only sound. The railcar was worse up close. Rust bloomed in great orange blossoms across its turquoise skin. The metal was cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to draw the life right out of his fingertips. He circled it slowly, a predator assessing its prey, or perhaps a mourner viewing a casket. It was long, heavy, and impossibly still. It was an object of purpose, now rendered purposeless. Yet, as he stood there, feeling the weight of his solitude settle upon him like a shroud, he did not feel despair. He felt a question. His father had been an engineer, a man obsessed with systems, with the unseen forces of heat and pressure and flow. A man who had died with nothing but debts and a book full of intricate, baffling diagrams. Finn reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the legal document, and beneath it, the worn leather of his father's notebook. He looked from the abandoned railcar to the sprawling, empty landscape, and a quiet, unshakable resolve began to form in the very marrow of his bones. This was not an end. It was a beginning. It was a laboratory. Finn spent the last of his orphanage stipend not on a warm room at the town's boarding house or a hot meal at the saloon, but at Martha's Mercantile, the cavernous general store that smelled of dried apples, kerosene, and dust. Martha, a woman whose face was a roadmap of prairie hardships, watched with growing curiosity as he made his selections. He didn't buy bacon or beans, the staples of survival. Instead, he requested a heavy-duty shovel, 2 large buckets, a coil of thick rope, and several pounds of dark, viscous pine pitch. He added a set of brushes, a small barrel of tallow, and, most perplexingly, every single sheet of black-painted tin she had in stock, originally meant for patching leaky roofs. "That's a peculiar shopping list for a newcomer," Martha observed, her hands on her hips. "You fixing to build something, or tear something down?" Finn, who had a habit of letting silence answer for him, simply met her gaze for a moment before replying, "Just getting my property in order." His words were so matter-of-fact they offered no room for argument, only more questions. The town watched as he began his work. He did not try to pry the railcar from its rusted tracks or attempt to salvage its parts for scrap, the two most logical courses of action. Instead, he began to dig. With the grim determination of a man digging a grave, he shoveled away the snow and frozen earth from around the base of the car. He worked from the first hint of grey dawn until the sky bled into a bruised purple twilight. His movements were methodical, rhythmic, conserving energy with an intelligence that belied his youth. He was not just clearing the area, he was sculpting it. He dug a deep, wide trench that encircled the entire railcar, and then another, shallower channel that snaked away from it, towards a low-lying patch of ground. He ignored the stares and the muttered comments from the few townsfolk who passed by. He ate his dry bread and cured meat while sitting on the cold earth, his eyes constantly studying the turquoise shell, analyzing its angles, its exposure to the low-hanging winter sun. After the digging, he turned his attention to the car itself. He used the brushes and buckets of melted snow to scrub the grime from its sides, not for aesthetics, but to expose the metal skin beneath. Then came the sealing. He heated the pine pitch over a small, contained fire, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes. He meticulously painted every seam, every rivet, every hairline crack where the cold could infiltrate, transforming the rusted hulk into a dark, gleaming, waterproof vessel. He wasn't just patching it, he was making it airtight. The inside was a cavern of cold and echoes. He swept out the debris of a decade, dust, dried leaves, the husks of long-dead insects. He found nothing of value, only the skeletal frames of passenger benches and the ghosts of 1,000 forgotten journeys. He did not seem disappointed. He was not looking for treasure. He was preparing a canvas. The townsfolk of Prosperity Gulch, having little else to entertain them as winter tightened its grip, settled on a name for him, the Railcar Boy. It was spoken with a mixture of pity and mild derision, the way one might speak of a harmless lunatic. His relentless, nonsensical labor was the primary topic of conversation at the saloon and over the cracker barrel at Martha's store. "He's sealing it up like a tin of peaches," one man scoffed. "What's he plan to do when the snows come proper?" "Hibernate." The town sheriff, a man named Brody with a weary face and a sense of duty that weighed on him like his heavy coat, felt compelled to intervene. He found Finn on a particularly cold afternoon, hauling large, flat stones from a distant creek bed, dragging them one by one on a makeshift sled. "Son," Brody began, his voice firm but not unkind, "I've let you be. A man's property is his own. But the old-timers are saying this winter's going to be a bad one. A real killer. That metal box will be an icehouse in a week. It'll be a tomb." Finn paused, setting down the rope to his sled. He wiped a smear of dirt from his brow with the back of a frozen glove, his breath pluming in the frigid air. "I appreciate the concern, Sheriff," he said, his voice even. "I have a plan," Brody sighed, a sound of deep frustration. "A plan?" "Everyone out here has a plan until the first rail blizzard hits. We have a small cell at the jail. It's warm. There's the boarding house. You can't live out here." Finn's eyes drifted back to the turquoise car, now webbed with black lines of pitch. "I'm not planning to live out here," he replied cryptically. "I'm planning to live in there." He turned back to his stone, leaving the sheriff standing in a state of baffled defeat. The skepticism only grew when Finn began installing the stones inside the car. He carefully laid them across the floor, creating a thick, raised platform of solid rock that covered nearly the entire interior surface. Then he turned his attention to the roof, affixing the black-painted tin sheets he'd bought from Martha, creating a strange, dark patchwork on top of the turquoise paint. From a distance, it looked as if he were armoring the car against the sky. Abel, an old prospector who had seen his share of fortune seekers and fools, watched Finn's progress from the porch of his small cabin at the edge of town. He'd seen men try to divine for water with sticks and others try to build flying machines out of canvas and hope. The boy's project had the same flavor of madness. "He's putting rocks inside it," Abel muttered to himself, shaking his head. "To weigh it down? It ain't going nowhere." The boy's chasing a ghost to the entire town of Prosperity Gulch. Finn was engaged in a grand, silent folly, a battle against logic and winter that he was destined to lose. The breakthrough in understanding came from the one person who had shown him a sliver of kindness. Martha, her conscience pricked by the sight of the boy working himself to the bone in the biting cold, finally walked out to the siding one evening, carrying a steaming tin cup of beef broth. "You'll kill yourself before the cold gets a chance," she said, her tone stern to hide the sympathy in her eyes. "Drink this." Finn stopped his work, which now involved rigging a peculiar series of small pipes and funnels along the roofline. He took the cup, his frozen fingers wrapping around its warmth. He drank the broth slowly, gratefully, and for the first time, he saw not a skeptic, but a witness. He made a decision. "Thank you," he said, his voice a little rough from disuse. He then gestured for her to come closer to the railcar. People think I'm a fool. It was a statement, not a question. Martha just nodded. They don't understand what I'm doing, he continued. My father was an engineer. He never built much, but he thought about things. About systems. He led her to the deep trench he had dug. This isn't for drainage. Look, he pointed to a small, covered opening at the base of the railcar's foundation. This trench will catch the coldest, heaviest air and channel it down into an insulated pit I dug directly beneath the car. Cold air sinks. It will naturally flow away. He then pointed to the black tin sheets on the roof. And that's not for patching leaks. That's the engine. He pulled his father's worn notebook from his coat, its pages filled with elegant, spidery script and precise drawings. He opened it to a diagram that looked remarkably like the railcar. The sun, even the weak winter sun, will hit the black tin. The tin heats up. Directly beneath it is a sealed air gap, about 2 inches deep, running the length of the car. The air inside that gap gets hot. Very hot. He then traced a line on the diagram. Pipes carry that superheated air from the roof down along the interior walls and into the empty spaces underneath the stone floor I built. He tapped the drawing of the rock platform. This, he said, his voice filled with a quiet passion, is a thermal mass. All day, the hot air circulates around these stones, and they soak up the heat, like a sponge soaks up water. All night, they radiate that heat back into the sealed car. It's a slow-release furnace that doesn't need any fuel. He pointed to the funnels on the roof. Those will catch what little snow melts during the day. The water is channeled inside, through a filter I made of sand and charcoal, into barrels. It's a closed system. Heat, water, shelter. My father called it a passive survival engine. He believed you could live anywhere if you understood how to capture and store energy. Martha stared from the notebook to the strange, modified railcar. The nonsensical action suddenly clicked into a breathtakingly elegant design. The trenches, the stones, the tin sheets, they weren't madness. They were components of a brilliant, silent machine. My goodness, she whispered, the cup forgotten in her hand. He thought of everything. The sky began to bleed from grey to a deep, ominous purple, a color that signaled more than just a storm. The wind, which had been a constant, nagging presence, fell completely silent. An unnatural stillness descended on Prosperity Gulch. I held breath before a scream. The old-timers, who read the land like a book, felt a primal fear. This wasn't a normal blizzard. This was a white wolf, a storm of legend that came once a generation to scour the earth clean. When the snow began, it did not drift down in gentle flakes. It came horizontally, a blinding, stinging torrent of white driven by a wind that rose from a whisper to a physical wall of force in less than an hour. The world outside vanished. Visibility dropped to 0. The temperature plummeted with an alarming speed, far below what anyone had prepared for. The town of Prosperity Gulch, built on the assumption of manageable hardship, began to break. The poorly chinked walls of the cabins let in razor-sharp drafts. The roof of the saloon, which served as the town's unofficial gathering place, began to groan under the impossible weight of the fast-accumulating snow. Sheriff Brody, making a desperate final round to ensure no one was caught outside, could barely see his own hands in front of his face. The roar of the wind was deafening, a constant, high-pitched shriek that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. He fought his way past the turnoff to the rail siding. The snow already drifted higher than his head. He thought of the railcar boy, alone in his metal shell, and a profound sense of failure washed over him. The boy was surely already gone, a frozen statue in his monument to foolishness. Brody had tried to warn him, but he hadn't forced him. He would carry that with him. Inside their homes, families huddled together, feeding their stoves with a desperate fervor, watching their precious woodpiles dwindle at an alarming rate. The cold was a living entity, seeping through the floors, creeping down the chimneys, turning every nail head in the walls into a point of frost. The town was an archipelago of failing fires in a sea of absolute cold. The storm was not a passing event, it was a siege. For 2 days it raged without pause. The sound of the wind became the only reality, a maddening, all-consuming noise that frayed nerves and extinguished hope. The world shrank to the confines of four walls, and the creeping fear that the firewood would run out before the storm did. Prosperity Gulch was cut off, isolated, and being slowly, methodically frozen to death. On the third day, the wind relented for a few hours, its shriek diminishing to a low, guttural moan. The silence that followed was almost as terrifying. Abel, the old prospector, awoke to a cabin that was dangerously cold. His firewood was down to a handful of splinters, not enough to last another night. His only choice was to risk the journey to Martha's Mercantile, praying she had some fuel to spare. He wrapped himself in every layer he owned and pushed open his door, only to be met by a solid wall of snow. It took him nearly an hour to tunnel out into the new world the storm had created. It was a landscape of alien beauty and immense danger, with drifts sculpted into towering waves and canyons of white. The town was almost unrecognizable, buried. As he struggled through a trench of his own making, his path took him past the high ground where the railcar was supposed to be. It was gone, completely swallowed by a monolithic drift of snow, a seamless white mountain where the turquoise car had once stood. Abel paused to catch his breath, a pang of sadness for the foolish boy touching his cynical heart. And then he saw it. Rising from the very peak of the enormous snowdrift was a thin, almost invisible pipe. From its opening, a steady, unwavering plume of clean white steam unfurled into the frigid air. It was not smoke from a fire. It was the vapor of hot water, a sign of life and warmth so impossible in this frozen hell that he thought his eyes were failing him. Driven by a surge of adrenaline and disbelief, he scrambled up the side of the drift, his boots sinking deep into the powder. He clawed his way to the top until he was standing directly over the buried railcar. He reached the source of the steam, a simple metal vent pipe, warm to the touch. He fell to his knees and pressed his ear against the snow, listening. He heard nothing. Then, with a frantic energy, he began to dig, scraping away the snow with his gloved hands until he reached the cold, hard surface of the roof. He laid his bare palm against the metal. It was not warm, not like a stove. But it was not the soul-stealing cold of the outside world. It held a faint, but distinct, lack of cold. A neutrality that, in this environment, felt like a roaring fire. He pressed his face against it, feeling the impossible truth. It was working. The entire car, buried under 10 feet of insulating snow, had become a geothermal pocket, a bubble of life. He slid down the drift, his mind reeling. The boy wasn't a fool. He hadn't built a tomb. He had built an ark. Abel turned and plunged back towards the buried town, a wild cry building in his chest. "He's alive," he screamed to the unhearing landscape. "The boy is alive." Abel burst into the saloon, his face wild and covered in frost, his words tumbling out in a frantic, breathless rush. "The boy. The railcar. It's warm. I felt it. There's steam coming out of the snow." The handful of men huddled around the main stove, which was now burning furniture to stay lit, looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with exhaustion, put a hand on the old prospector's shoulder. "Settle down, Abel. The cold's got you seeing things." "The boy's gone, no," Abel insisted, shaking the sheriff's hand away. "I'm telling you. It's a miracle. He did it. Whatever he was building, it worked." Desperation is a powerful antidote to disbelief. There was a flicker of something in Abel's crazed eyes, not madness, but awe. For men facing the grim prospect of freezing to death in their own homes, the slimmest chance of a miracle was better than none. "All right, Abel," Brody said slowly, a sliver of hope warring with his pragmatic nature. "Show us." The small, grim party formed, Brody, Abel, and 2 other men, armed with shovels. They followed Abel's tracks, digging a narrow path through the transformed landscape. It was brutal, exhausting work. When they finally reached the colossal snowdrift, they saw the wisp of steam for themselves, a quiet flag of defiance in the frozen world. The sight sent a jolt through them. Abel had been telling the truth. Brody moved to the spot Abel had indicated and began to shovel. The others joined in, digging with a renewed, desperate energy. After several minutes, their shovels struck the metal roof of the railcar with a dull clang. Brody hammered on the surface with the handle of his shovel. "Hello? Anyone in there?" "Finn." They waited, their breath held in clouds of white. A muffled sound came from beneath the snow. Then, a scraping noise. A section of the drift near the side of the car began to shift, and a door, engineered to swing inwards, opened into the snowbank. A figure appeared in the opening, silhouetted against a soft, steady light. It was Finn. He looked tired but calm. And as he opened the door, a wave of impossibly warm, dry air washed over their frozen faces. It felt like stepping into another world. They peered inside. The interior was bathed in the gentle glow of a single, efficient oil lamp. The air was not just warm, it was comfortable. The stone floor radiated a pleasant heat that seemed to seep into their bones. Along one wall, barrels of water stood in a neat row, a small spigot on the first one indicating they were ready for use. On shelves built into the wall were organized rations of food. It was not a chaotic shelter, it was a sanctuary of perfect order and life. The men stood in stunned, reverent silence. They saw the elegant pipes running along the ceiling, the sealed seams, the sheer, brilliant simplicity of it all. They looked at Finn, this quiet boy they had mocked, and saw not a fool, but a savior. Sheriff Brody was the first to find his voice, his words thick with humility and awe. "Son," he said, his gaze sweeping over the haven Finn had built. Can you spare some room?" Finn simply looked at the exhausted, freezing faces of the men who had doubted him, and gave a single, solemn nod. That winter, the turquoise railcar became the heart of Prosperity Gulch. It was not large enough for everyone, but it was a refuge for the most vulnerable. Finn directed the men to dig connecting tunnels from the main drift to the doors of nearby cabins, creating a small, subterranean network. The warmth from the railcar, combined with the insulating power of the snow, created a space where the community could survive the remainder of the great storm. When the blizzard finally broke and the sun returned to a world remade in white, the legend of the railcar boy was cemented. He was no longer an object of pity, but a figure of profound respect. The town had not just been saved by his ingenuity, they had been humbled by it. They emerged from the storm not as conquerors of the West, but as students of it. In the spring, the work began. Finn, no longer a solitary laborer, became a teacher. With his father's notebook as their guide, he showed the townspeople the principles of the passive survival engine. They didn't just rebuild, they re-engineered. They learned to dig foundations deeper, to incorporate thermal mass floors of stone and packed earth into their own homes. They learned to orient their buildings to the sun, to glaze their windows with treated parchment in a way that maximized heat gain. The turquoise railcar, now affectionately known as the Ark, was never moved. It was preserved as a monument and a functional piece of the town's infrastructure. It became the community's winter library and a secure seed bank, protecting the next season's promise from the harsh elements. The town of Prosperity Gulch began to change. Its reputation shifted from a desperate gold rush settlement to a beacon of resilience. Settlers heading west would stop not for supplies, but for knowledge, eager to learn the secrets of surviving, and even thriving, in the brutal northern winters. Finn, who had arrived with nothing, found himself at the center of a grateful community. He never sought leadership, but it was given to him. He was appointed the town engineer, a title he accepted with the same quiet gravity with which he had accepted his strange inheritance. The vibrant turquoise of the railcar, once a lonely symbol of abandonment, became the town's official color. They painted the door of the new town hall in the same shade, a constant reminder of the winter they nearly lost, and the boy who taught them how to create their own warmth. The Ark stood as a testament not to a single man's survival, but to the dawn of a new kind of wisdom on the frontier, the understanding that true prosperity wasn't dug from the ground, but built from knowledge, observation, and a willingness to see potential where others saw only junk. Years later, Finn would sit on the porch of the small, efficient home the town had built for him, looking out over a Prosperity Gulch that was green and thriving in the summer sun. He was a man now, his face lined by weather and time, but his eyes held the same quiet, analytical calm. He often thought back to that first day, standing alone on the platform, the weight of the legal document in his pocket. He had learned that day that an inheritance is rarely what it appears to be. His father had not left him a rusting metal box. He had left him a challenge, a final exam. The railcar was worthless on its own, its value was locked in the pages of the notebook, in the theories of a man who died before he could prove them. The true inheritance was the knowledge, and the desperate, driving need to give that knowledge form. He remembered the faces of the townspeople, their initial scorn and pity. He never held it against them. Skepticism is the natural armor of people who live on the edge of disaster. Their doubt had been a crucible, forging his resolve, making the eventual validation that much more profound. Their acceptance, when it came, was absolute. They had not just welcomed him, they had allowed his ideas to reshape their entire existence. They had become his family, a sprawling, cantankerous, and deeply loyal one. He never married or had children of his own, but every new, warm-roofed home, every successful winter harvest from the community greenhouse, a larger, more advanced version of the Ark, felt like his progeny. His legacy was written not in a family tree, but in the architecture of survival. Sometimes, during the quiet hours of a winter night, he would walk to the railcar, now connected to the town hall by a covered walkway. He would step inside and feel the gentle, radiant heat from the stone floor, a warmth born only of the sun and intelligent design. In the silent, warm dark, he felt the closest he ever would to his father. He had not just honored his father's memory, he had completed his life's work. He had taken the theoretical and made it real, proving that even in the most desolate of places, a single, brilliant idea, pursued with relentless patience, could change everything. His life had not been one of grand adventure or accumulated riches, but of a deeper, more satisfying purpose, to find a discarded, forgotten thing and make it the cornerstone of a community's future. And so, we are left to wonder about the inheritances in our own lives. What have you been given that seems, at first glance, to be a burden? A worthless piece of property, a strange and seemingly useless skill passed down, a challenge that feels more like a curse than an opportunity. We all have our own turquoise railcars, sitting abandoned at the edge of our vision. They are the forgotten projects, the daunting tasks, the peculiar ideas that society dismisses as foolish. They are the things that require us to see a hidden system where others see only rust and decay. Finn's story is not about the magic of survival, but the physics of it. It is a testament to the profound power of quiet, methodical work. The validation did not come in a single, glorious moment of discovery, but was earned through weeks of back-breaking, thankless labor. It was earned in the digging of the trenches, the sealing of the seams, the hauling of the stones. The miracle that the town witnessed was not a miracle at all, it was the inevitable result of a sound theory relentlessly applied. Look closely at the things you have dismissed. Is there a hidden engine waiting to be understood? A thermal mass waiting to be charged? Perhaps the solution to your coldest winter is not to find a bigger fire, but to build a better system for capturing the light you are already given. The greatest legacies are rarely handed to us, polished and complete. They are given as raw materials, as problems to be solved. The true inheritance is not the object itself, but the opportunity it presents, the chance to apply intelligence, to persevere through doubt, and to build something of lasting value from the scraps that others have thrown away. It is the quiet, determined process of turning a tomb into an ark. The greatest inheritances are not the ones that give you a head start, but the ones that demand you build the path yourself. They are the ones that, in the coldest of winters, teach you how to create your own warmth.